Kids with autism tend to have sensory issues, so many schools, residential placements, and even other places like hospitals are building sensory rooms. Today I'm going to talk about sensory rooms for kids with autism. Hi, I'm Dr. Mary Barbera, autism mom, board certified behavior analyst, online course creator, and best-selling author of The Verbal Behavior Approach. Each week, I provide you with some of my ideas about turning autism around. So if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, you can do that now. I'm a behavior analyst, not an occupational therapist, so I tend to look at things, including sensory rooms, with a behavioral lens. I did a recent blog on the topic of sensory issues where I discussed doing an assessment of the child's strengths and needs, including sensory issues. And I also covered the use of some sensory interventions like noise canceling headphones, desensitizing kids to non-preferred foods, and modifying clothing to make children more comfortable. So you can check that video blog out later if you need to. But now I want to talk about sensory rooms. As I said a minute ago, many schools and even now hospitals are starting to create sensory rooms, and some schools also just have sensory items in the classroom. Some home programs, you're using sensory activities and sensory items. And then there's dedicated sensory rooms, which can be a real benefit, but can also cause problems. The problem with sensory items and sensory rooms in general is they're often used willy-nilly, as I call it. These rooms are used incorrectly, resulting in more problem behaviors and less benefit. So here are 3 examples, real-life examples that I've seen where sensory rooms have been misused and caused more problems. One little girl, I'll call her Laura, she was entering first grade, new school, after she had been homeschooled for kindergarten, and she was at level 3 of the VB map. She was almost completed with the VB map, which puts her at about a 4-year-old level of language, even though she was 7-ish going to first grade. On her schedule, she had first thing in the morning, she would go to the sensory room, or maybe she'd go to inclusion for a little bit for calendar time, and then she'd go to the sensory room for a 15 or 20 minute period, and then she would go somewhere else for instruction. When I went to observe her the first time, she's in the sensory room as per her schedule with an aide sitting there, and Laura is kind of crashing in the ball pit and going on the swing and bouncing on a ball. She seemed happy and all, but here she is going to be included for half the day, most of the day with her typically developing peers. She doesn't know how to read, and she is not really benefiting from this sensory room activities. This is as what I call is just free play or fill time. And I saw no goals and no reason for her to be in a sensory room on a schedule. So one point is, just because a child has autism and the school has a sensory room does not mean that a particular child should spend any time in the sensory room. We need to look at what are the goals for this sensory room, and if it's just free play, this child could probably be benefiting more from being with typically developing peers, or could be learning in an intensive teaching environment. The second experience I had was a little boy, I'll call him Alan. And they had a sensory room in his school. He, again, was a level 3 or above VB MAP learner, so he was almost conversational, had a lot of language, but also had a lot of deficits. He was included for most of the day with his typically developing peers. And while I was involved with his IEP, so he was not placed in the sensory room for sensory activities, because they had this room being unused most of the time, he was actually getting language for learning or language for thinking, which is a standardized curriculum. The aide was pulling him out of the classroom and taking him to the sensory room for a spot to learn. But it was very distracting, even just with the swing there and all the fun activities. But worst of all, she's doing instruction with Alan, and there are kids having sensory breaks, squealing and on the swings. And I told her that this is completely inappropriate to be trying to be using the sensory room with children in it and lots of distractions. So that was another way that a sensory room backfired. And the third example, I'll call this little boy Nick. This was years ago, but I went into the classroom. He was in an autism classroom for most of the day. He was doing math instructions, but when I got there, he was in the sensory room because he had just had a problem behavior during math where he, ripped up his paper or overturned the desk or something pretty severe. And I said, well, why is he in the sensory room? And they said, well, he just needs to decompress. He needs to take a break. This obviously was too hard. So that was used following problem behavior to calm the child down, thus reinforcing that problem behavior. And so there's just a lot wrong with that. So here is an example of where a sensory room worked for us. I'll call this little boy Jimmy. And Jimmy loved to jump and swing, and he was included for a lot of the day. And we would take a clicker like this. This is a counter clicker. And we would give him points for attending, for using his language, for writing, for participating in the classroom activities. And when Jimmy earned, I think it was 100 points, but we could set this criteria at anything. I mean, we could set it at 1,000 points or 500 points or 50 points. But when Jimmy earned 100 points, he was able to choose an activity, and that might be the sensory room. And the activity, let's just say he picked the sensory room as his activity for earning his 100 points. He would go into the sensory room with a 5-minute timer, and he would bounce and swing. And then he would, when the timer rang, go back to the general education environment. So in summary, sensory rooms can be helpful if they're used correctly and sandwiched between harder or less preferred tasks and used as a reinforcer. Sensory rooms shouldn't be used to fill time or as free play without goals or directions for the assistant who would be accompanying the child to the room. Sensory rooms should also not be used for direct instruction areas or as a timeout or break area after kids exhibit problem behavior, because this will lead to more issues. So I hope you enjoyed my take on sensory rooms. They can be useful, but we have to be super careful when we use them. Before you go, I'd love it if you would leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, share the video, let me know what you think about sensory rooms. And to learn more how to help children with autism, you can sign up for a free online workshop at marybarbera.com/workshops, and you can watch one of those free workshops to help you. I'll see you right here next week.